GraceLifeBibleChurch.com and click on January 23, Lesson 164. If you click on that and open it up, there is also a link there so that you can follow along with us here on the same notes that we are using here in class. I think on YouTube there's a link in the description under the video, but sometimes lately that hasn't been working. I'm not sure why. But you can always find the notes on the church website, GraceLifeBibleChurch.com. So anyway, I want to welcome everybody to class again. You should have Lesson 164, the Work in Progress Documents, Analyzing the Pre-1611 Evidence for the Text, Part 3. So this is the third study that we're going to do on this analyzing of the evidence. And again, I'm doing this for the sake of completeness, not to unnecessarily try everyone's patience, but there is interesting things that have come to light here. Sylvia, having had the benefit of reading the notes in advance to help me edit them, said that she thought this was interesting. I hope you did as well, Mike, but we are definitely going to be looking at this here. So, good morning, Bart.
Morning.
Lesson 164, Introduction. The last two lessons, Lesson 162 and 163, have been devoted to a discussion of the extant primary work-in-progress documents that speak to the process used by the King James translators to create the King James Bible. Specifically, we have looked at Manuscript 98, BOD 1602, and the notes of John Boyce. So we looked at some preliminary things about Manuscript 98 and BOD 1602 in Lesson 162, and then we looked at, last week, the notes of John Boyce in Lesson 163. So, in doing so, we have only considered them in terms of the first of the following three categories: scholarly awareness and published access. Okay? So if you look at I said we were going to talk about all three of them in relationship to these three categories: scholarly awareness and published access, physical description and contents, and then impacts on the readings found in the King James Bible. So as of right now, we have only looked at the first point: scholarly awareness and published access for Manuscript 98, BOD 1602, and the notes of John Boyce. And again, we did that in Lesson 162 and 163. So we have not yet talked about the physical description and contents or the impact on the readings of the King James Bible. We haven't looked at those 2 points yet, okay? So, third dark bullet, starting with originally. Originally, I planned on using this lesson to look at the physical description and contents of Manuscript 98. That was before additional and more recent primary work-in-progress discoveries were brought to my attention literally last week. Okay? Last week, on Monday, January 10, I got involved in a conversation with somebody in the private message feature of Facebook. This person was sharing with me some details of some things that before last week I was not aware of, okay? However, I am now, and I've done a lot of reading on it in the last 2 weeks, and so we definitely need to include this. So when I originally wrote Lesson 162 and 163, thinking we were going to look at scholarly awareness, etc., and just go straight through that, I wasn't aware of what I'm going to cover with you today, okay? So let's look at that point again. Originally, I planned on using this lesson to look at the physical description and contents of Manuscript 98. That was before additional and more recent primary work-in-progress discoveries were brought to my attention last week. Unbeknownst to me, researchers uncovered additional document finds in British libraries in the middle to the latter half of the last decade. So that would be between 2011 and 2020. That's what I'm referring to by the last decade. I would like to thank Christopher Yetzer, is how I would say it, and Timothy Berg for bringing these discoveries to my attention. Christopher Yetzer in particular was the gentleman who I was conversing with last Monday on the 10th and kind of making me aware of a couple things, which then set me on a course of discovery to find out about this information, okay? These discoveries include the following documents. The first one is something called MS Manuscript Ward B in the possession of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, and 3 unpublished letters between Frenchman Isaac Casaubon, yes, Casaubon, Casaubon, and John Boyce that are in the British Library, okay? So we have two other things here that we need to take note of, okay? Writing for the Church Times, a Hattie Williamson published an article dated the 4th of May, 2018, titled, "Frenchmen with Poor English Help Translate the King James Bible, Says Scholar." Now that's definitely a catchy headline, right? How is a Frenchman that doesn't know very good English helping with the translation of the King James Bible? Well, can all these guys converse with each other in Latin, even if the guy couldn't speak English? So he could definitely be asked his opinion through Latin correspondence, which we'll see here eventually, okay? So anyway, there's an article published, and I have it right here. This is the article that I'm referring to here from the 4th of May, 2018. The article discusses the manuscript finds of Dr. Nicholas Hardy of the University of Birmingham. Quote, "But the question how the translators collaborated to complete this task has been a mystery until the discovery of Dr. Hardy of 3 new sources in the British Library in London and the Bodleian Libraries in Oxford that had previously gone unnoticed by scholars for 400 years. This included a print copy of an ancient Greek version of the Old Testament, which had been in the Bodleian collection since the 1650s, whose annotator was unknown until Dr. Hardy recognized the writing as that of John Boyce, one of the translators of the King James Bible." So in the library, there is a Latin version, and here's a picture of it. And here are the notes of John Boyce in the margin. Okay, so this is a Greek Latin interlinear. All right, so this was there, and nobody really knew what it was until this Dr. Hardy gentleman sort of figured it out. Okay, look at the next paragraph. This led to Dr. Hardy's discovery in the British Library of a set of 3 unpublished letters between Casaubon and Boyce discussing different elements of the translation. Dr. Hardy then returned to Bodleian collections to find Casaubon's notebooks recording conversations he had with another translator, Andrew Downes, about further problems associated with the translation. So you look at the date on this article. This is dated 2018. It's talking about things that literally had been sort of figured out within the last 7 years. Okay? So, like I said, up till last week, I wasn't necessarily aware of all this stuff, okay? So while these discoveries are amazing finds, they are not necessarily all work-in-progress documents, okay, that speak directly to the translation process utilized by the translators. Therefore, we will limit our comments in this class to Manuscript Ward B and the correspondence between John Boyce and Isaac Casaubon. That said, the existence of the annotated edition of the Greek Old Testament by Boyce and the notebook of Casaubon recording his correspondence with Andrew Downes need to be noted. Further study of these documents could shed more light on the translation process in the future. So those remain largely sort of unstudied in a way that the public can be aware of through published access. But they are there. Scholars know now of their existence in these different collections, and I would anticipate in the future more stuff coming out about these things that we just don't know right now as I stand here and teach this lesson. So, the rest of this lesson will be devoted to a discussion of Manuscript Ward B. Next week in Lesson 165, we will look at the letters between Boyce and Casaubon, okay? So any questions before we move on into the next point?
Bryan, I just got one. You got to go to the next page for them.
If there's something to show.
Right. I didn't know if you do that or not.
No, well, I appreciate you pointing it out, but I sometimes lose track of what we're doing here, and they can follow along hopefully on their own notes, unless I'm showing images or pictures or something, but thank you.
When it says Dr. Hardy recognized the writing, did he just recognize his hand script?
Yes, because he could compare it to other things written, but that we know are written by Boyce, and he recognized it to be his handwriting, and then when he looked at it more carefully, he realized it was his notations on let me just put this back up here.
So that's why it hadn't been recognized.
Correct.
Before.
So here's the Greek, so this is what's called a Greek Old Testament, or Septuagint. Here's all Boyce's notes written in the margins of this thing, okay? Now the reason we don't know if these notes were put there before he started working on the translation or after, okay? From what I can gather in the preliminary work that's been done on this, the scholars believe that there's a little bit of both. So no one's really sure if this document should be classified as a work in progress document or just an interesting piece of historical findings of Boyce's thoughts about the apocryphal section of the Septuagint. Okay, is everybody with that? All right, so let's look at the next one. On October 16, 2015, a periodical called the Times Literary Supplement ran an article by Jeffrey Allen Miller titled "The Fruit of Good Labors," the earliest known draft of the King James Bible. As the title suggests, Miller announces that he found a heretofore earliest, it should say unknown. Announced that he found a heretofore unknown draft of the King James Bible, which is believed now to be the earliest. Here's a picture of this article. This is the article I'm talking about from October 2015 from the Literary Times by Miller talking about the fruit of good labors in this discovery of Manuscript Ward B. Okay, look at the next entry. A more extensive on the King James Bible titled Labors in the Vineyard of the Lord, Erudition and the Making of the King James Version of the Bible. Miller's essay is chapter 7 of this volume. So here you can see chapter 7. I had to buy this chapter off of Brill.com. This is not available for free anywhere on the internet. And the whole book is like $200, which I didn't buy. I just bought chapter 7. And this is the more lengthy treatment, okay? This article here is an announcement in a publication. So it's much shorter. This is a full-piece scholarly essay written as chapter 7 of a larger book or a compilation of essays related to the King James Bible. So I have both of them. I have read both of them. We are going to follow, though, for this class, the shorter one. Just because if we followed the longer one, do that, all right? So look at the next point. Miller begins his 2015 piece by acknowledging the three primary work-in-progress documents that we have already discussed, i.e. Manuscript 98, Bod 1602, and the notes of John Boyce. Regarding these drafts, as Miller calls them, he states the following quote, "All of the drafts are also written in as yet unidentified hands, and it seems likely that they in fact belong not to any of the translators themselves, but rather to professional scribes producing copies of now lost drafts on their behalf. Moreover, certain parts of the Bible have been left without any extant drafts behind them whatever, making the composition process, not just for those specific portions of the translation, but for the work as a whole, even harder to assess in full. Thanks to a newly discovered draft in Cambridge, however, a number of these gaps and others can at last be filled in, or at last begin to be filled. For in the archives of Sydney Sussex College, there survives the earliest known draft of any part of the King James Bible, unmistakably in the hand of one of the King James Bible translators, okay? So what Miller's talking about there is the fact that we have three snapshots in Manuscript 98, Bod 1602, and the notes of Boyce into different pieces or stages of the process, okay? But we don't necessarily have as clear connections in how we should put those together. But now we have another document uncovered at Sydney Sussex College, and by the way, here's the website. Here's the images of Manuscript Ward B. And you can see here it says draft of the King James translation of 1st Esdrast and draft of the King James translation of Wisdom 3 and 4. So we can look at this work. This is Ward's notebook where he's recording his findings and observations here as he's going through the apocryphal section. Here's him actually scripting out his observations in his own hand as he's working on this section, okay? So we have images, and thankfully, they've been pretty liberal in how many pictures they've provided on the internet. You can look at a whole bunch of them. Unlike some of the other things we've looked at where you can see maybe 10 or 1 or something like that, Sydney Sussex College has provided basically the whole thing for somebody to look at, okay? Let's go back to the notes and make sure we understand what we're looking at. And again, I apologize for struggling with my voice here a little bit. I'm sure you can pick up on it that it's not totally great at the moment. Miller goes on to state the following regarding the origin and provenance of this, quote, earliest known draft of the King James Bible. The draft appears in a manuscript notebook formerly belonging to Samuel Ward, 1572 through 1643, who was part of the team of 7 men in Cambridge charged with translating the Apocrypha. For centuries, Ward's papers in the college lay almost entirely neglected and uncatalogued. The situation persisted until 1985. That year, Margot Todd published a landmark study of the collection, the Samuel Ward papers at Sydney Sussex College, in which she supplied the Ward manuscripts with the alphabetical classifications they now possess and gave a brief description of each manuscript's contents. Todd described MS Ward B as containing, quote, a verse-by-verse biblical commentary with Greek word studies and some Hebrew notes. Now, I also have Margot Todd's essay right here. Pulled this off the internet as well. I think I've had to pay for this one. And this is the Samuel Ward papers at Sydney Sussex College by Margot Todd from 1985. So I have also read that in preparation for this, okay? So this was there for hundreds of years. No one really knew what it was until Margot Todd figured out that this stuff is the writings of Samuel Ward, one of the translators who served on the second Cambridge company that worked on the apocryphal section of the King James Bible. Next point. Miller then explains his first impression of manuscript Ward B after seeing it for the first time. Quote, when I looked at the notebook myself for the first time, there didn't seem to be much more to it than that. In other words, what Margot Todd said. And remember, that was the last quote. Margot Todd described manuscript Ward B as simply verse-by-verse biblical commentary with Greek word studies and some Hebrew notes. So when Miller sees it for the first time, he says there didn't seem to be much more to it than that. So even though Margot Todd catalogs it, does she realize wholly what it is yet? The answer is she does not. Okay? So back to the quote. Where are we at? The part of the Bible to which Ward was referring, however, had been left tantalizingly unspecified, both in Todd's description and in the notebook itself. So he's noting there that Todd didn't realize what it was, and there's like no title page in this that says, here's what you're looking at. It's just turn the page and there it is. Okay? As I sought to determine the biblical verses concerned and which translation Ward seemed to be using, the manuscript's true significance suddenly came into focus. So as Miller is looking at it and studying it, he's starting to realize what he's looking at. Okay? Next point. Miller then digresses for a moment to comment on the term draft that is particularly elusive when applied to the process used to translate the King James Bible. Quote, it is worth saying something about the term draft as it applies to the King James Bible. For an ill-fitting notion of what a draft of the work might resemble may be one of the reasons why so few have ever been discovered. All the evidence suggests that the King James translators took to heart the injunction that their translation be a revision of the bishop's Bible. Hence, for example, the decision, even at later stages of the work, to produce nearly full drafts of the Old Testament and the Gospels in the form of emendations and marginal annotations made directly to pages of the bishop's Bible itself, 40 unbound copies of which had been supplied to the translators to aid them in their work. So what he's saying there is, Bod 1602 is a bishop's Bible with the annotations and emendations made entered straight into it, and then bound together, okay? Indeed, the King James Bible may ultimately have been printed from an annotated bishop's Bible. This means that if in looking for drafts of the King James translation, one looks only for manuscripts where the translation of every single book has been worked out or written out in full, then such a draft might never materialize. You understand what he's saying? Okay? So, the chances of us finding the master draft that was handed by the translators to the printer is probably extremely remote. I've read quite a bit that says that it may have burned in the Great London Fire of, I believe, 1666 or something like that. And so it may be lost, just never able to be recovered and found because of that. So, top page 4. Next, Miller elucidates these thoughts by applying them specifically to MS Ward B. The draft found in Manuscript Ward B throws this vividly into relief. In 2 different places in the notebook, there appears what seems to be nothing but a sequence of running notes on the bishop's translation of 2 different apocryphal books. The longer of the 2 sequences, occupying 66 pages of the notebook in total, covers all 9 chapters from the first to the last of the book known as First Esdrast or Third Ezra, positioned first in the King James Bible among the Apocrypha. So if you look at a 1611 King James Bible, First Esdras is the first apocryphal book that shows up. What we have in Manuscript MS Ward B is a running list of all 9 chapters of First Esdras, of him commenting on the bishop's Bible text of First Esdras. Does that make sense? Okay. The shorter sequence, on the other hand, spans just chapters 3 and 4 of the apocryphal book Wisdom. In each case, the notes typically take a similar form. A verse number is given, followed by a quotation from the bishop's Bible translation, often only a word or phrase. This wording closes in a single bracket and then proceeds to provide an alternative English translation, usually juxtaposing it with the corresponding portion of the verse in Greek, the language in which the vast majority of the apocryphal books were known to survive at the time. For instance, a note in Ward's draft for 1 Esdras 1:2 simply reads, he set, having set, followed by a transcription of the Greek word from 1 Esdras in question. The entry represents Ward's suggestion that the Greek word translated as he set in the bishop's Bible should instead have been translated as having set. You see that? Now, I was hoping to be able to zoom in and show you what I'm talking about here. Might have to go to the previous page. So according to the website, this is the page that this starts on. And you can see here, verse, this looks like a 2, and then these are specific notes, and you can see here, he set, see that? Right here, he set, bracket, having set, and then a Greek word. So what he's saying in that simple note is that he thinks the bishop's translation of he set is wrong, and it should have been what? Having set. And you can see it right there in his own hand in the picture. I knew it was there, I just had to look for it. Is everybody following this? Okay? So clearly, this is the handwritten notes of a translator who is in the process of taking the bishop's Bible, going through it, comparing it against the original languages, and deciding if there need to be any translational adjustments in English. And in this particular case, for verse 2, 1 Esdras, chapter 1, verse 2, he says that he set should be having set. You guys following that? It's important that you're following that. Okay? Let's go back to the quote. The entry represents Ward's suggestion that the Greek word translated "he set" in the bishop's Bible should instead be translated as "having set." Now check it out. On turning to the King James Bible as it appeared in 1611, we find this is exactly what was done. So we need to look at that, okay? You need to see, and I should have already loaded this, but I forgot to do it. So let's go and to the Apocrypha. First Esdrast, we want verse 2. Okay, so here it is in the text. What's it say? Having said. So that annotation, that change, matches exactly with what Ward said in Manuscript MSB. So is he clearly going through the bishop's Bible here and adjusting the text so that he thinks in ways that more accurately represent the Greek, okay? So then when we go to a King James Bible, let's actually load the image here of the page. And you can see, let me zoom in. Here's verse 2, right here. And what does it say? Having said. So where did that change come from? Originally, it came from Manuscript MSB. You guys following this? Now, to me, I have to show you this stuff. Because if I don't show you, you're going to think I'm like talking pie in the sky here. Okay? I'm not talking pie in the sky. I'm talking about being able to literally go through the changes this translator thought should be made to the bishop's text of the Apocrypha and compare it against what ends up in the King James. You guys with me? Okay, next point. Miller goes on to discuss what M.S. Ward B might tell us about the manner in which the Second Cambridge Company conducted their work. Quote, This may have been what happened in some cases. Ward's draft, however, strongly implies that his company, the so-called Second Cambridge Company, went about translating the Apocrypha in a different way. No other hands besides Ward appears in the draft. So if you look at the picture, it's only his what? Handwriting. There's no other hands that appear in the draft. Moreover, it clearly shows him not just recording group decisions about the translation after the fact, or even doing so in the process of group decisions being made, but rather working out the translation for himself as he went along, making mistakes and changing his mind. At one point, for instance, one finds Ward wrestling with the syntax of 1 Esdras 6:23. In the Bishop's Bible, the first relates to somewhat convoluted fashion the declaration of King Darius that anyone found disobeying his decrees, quote, of his own goods should a tree be taken and thereupon be hanged. Proposing a revision to the front half of the passage, Ward at first began, quote, a tree, and then crossed it out. No, out of H, he started writing on a second thought, but then with which he had a second thought, but then crossed that out too. Skip the line. At last, he reverted back to the more straightforward construction which he had abortively begun, which also more closely mirrors the Greek of the passage, a tree should not be taken out of his possession. Moments like this simply do not chime with seeing Ward's draft as the product in the main of a company discussion. So in other words, it's his own what?
Discussion.
It's his own work. He's working on it, nope, see, like that. I'm going to do it this way, and then there's things scratched out here and then rewritten and so on and so forth. This is all indicative of him doing this all by himself, not a group discussion, him recording notes on a group discussion that happened afterwards. Is everybody with me? An analysis of the relationship between Ward's draft and the final product, i.e. the 1611 King James Bible, looms large over Miller's essay. Quote, such an example, however, also shows the complicated relationship that Ward's draft has to the translation as eventually published. In the King James Bible, only a very small piece of Ward's proposed revision for 1 Esdras 6:23 has been followed. The Bible broadly retains the Bishop's Bible syntax, even as it includes the clarifying out of recommended by Ward, specifying that the convicted man should be hanged on a tree taken out of his own property. Furthermore, there appears an additional revision to the passage not suggested in Ward's draft at all. The word goods in the Bishop's Bible, which Ward had proposed changing to possession, instead appears as in the King James Bible as house. In full, the King James translation of the passage would come to read, out of his own house should a tree be taken, and he thereon be what? Be hanged, right? So this shows us that Ward's revisions only are supplying parts of this, but was further work done to this after Ward's. You guys following that? Yeah. Okay? Disparities like this between the King James Bible and Ward's proposals run throughout the draft of 1 Esdras and Wisdom 3-4. They are indeed part of what helps identify Ward's draft as a draft, and not a mere record of the changes made to the Bishop's Bible in composing the King James Bible after the fact. Sometimes the King James translation went on to follow Ward's proposed rendering to the letter. In the case of Wisdom chapter 3 verse 15, for example, Ward's draft recommends changing the bishop's declaration that, quote, glorious is the fruit of good labor to glorious is the fruit of good labors, a translation that accords more with the Greek of the verse, as Ward notes, and which also aligns with the Geneva Bible, the English translation predating the King James Bible that the Puritan Ward clearly favored. Here, the King James Bible represents Ward's proposed revision exactly. You guys following this? So this is clearly a first draft piece that Ward is doing by himself as a translator in the company assigned to the Apocrypha, him going through here and recording his own first impressions of the text. Some of them show up in the King James, some of them don't. Some of them are partly revised further, some of them are not. You guys following that? At other times, however, the translation altogether rejects what Ward's draft proposes, or consigns it, interestingly, to a marginal note. Regarding the translation of 1 Esdras chapter 2 verse 7 and chapter 2 verse 9, for example, Ward proposes changing the Bishop's Bible's twin references to horses, suggesting that they both be replaced with the word substance. As he makes clear in the draft, though, this is not because Ward thinks the Bishop's Bible has mistranslated the Greek word for the Greek word form, 1 Esdras, in question. Rather, he believes the author of the Greek text of 1 Esdras itself has misunderstood or misrepresented a Hebrew word in the canonical book of Ezra, in which 1 Esdras there parallels. As Ward would write to himself in Latin elsewhere in the draft, in the context of a similar passage where he felt the author of 1 Esdras Greek had misunderstood a word from the Hebrew Bible, thus it seems did the very author of this book. 1 Esdras inaccurately translate yet another Hebrew word from the canonical book of Ezra, since he could not understand it. In the case of 1 Esdras 2:7 and 2:9, however, the King James Bible would ultimately retain the two references to horses, notwithstanding Ward's critique. Yet, as a marginal note, it would nevertheless include Ward's draft insistence that the Hebrew word possibly behind horses meant substance instead. You guys following that? So Ward says, this is a misunderstanding. It should be something else. The King James Bible ultimately retains the word horses and takes basically the gist of Ward's note from the notebook and moves it as a marginal note on that verse in the 1611 Bible. You guys follow what's going on here? Next, Miller walks his readers through the movement of Ward's draft of 1st Esdras and Wisdom 3 through 4 to the King James Bible's published version of the two books, in addition to triangulating it with other extant evidence. Quote, an important piece of collateral evidence lies outside of the draft in the biography of one of the other men, John Boyce, who served with Ward on the company of translators assigned to the Apocrypha. Notice how much Boyce keeps coming up? Okay, interesting to think about. Recounting Boyce's involvement in the translation, a biographer, a member of Boyce's own family, reports, quote, that part of the Apocrypha was allotted to him. But that after, quote, he had finished his own part, Boyce then, quote, undertook a second, being asked to do so, quote, at the earnest request of him to whom it was assigned. Read at face value, this too appears to suggest that the company to which Boyce and Ward belong assigned individual books or parts of books to individual members. It also seems to imply that certain members of the company evidently did not keep quite up with their end of the arrangement, obliging others like Boyce to step in and help translate additional parts of the Apocrypha as well. Boyce's biography has long been known, but since various aspects of it have been shown to be unreliable, including portions concerning the translation of the King James Bible, it had been hard to know exactly how much store to set by this testimony. The discovery of Ward's draft, though, provides compelling evidence that, at least with respect to the Apocryphal Company's supposed division of labor, Boyce's biography deserves to be credited. Certainly, what one finds in Ward's draft would perfectly align with the scenario outlined in the biography. Indeed, it would explain why the notebook containing Ward's draft of 1st Esdras includes a further draft only of Wisdom 3:4, despite there being a number of blank pages still available where a draft of other portions of the text could have been added. It would also explain why the partial draft of Wisdom comes in the notebook not immediately after the full draft of 1st Esdras, but rather in a different section written from the back and with writing concerning other matters, further separating the two drafts from another. So, what's he saying here? He's saying that this suggests that the Apocryphal Company said, you do this book, you do this book, you do this book, and they set out to individually work on it. Okay? Because in Ward's notebook, there's a gap between the end of his notes, 66 pages of notes on 1st Esdras, and where the pages on about wisdom start. You can see that right here. Okay? You can see that the image starts, there's a massive gap in spacing between when the 1st Esdras notes are found and when the notes on Wisdom 3:4 are found, indicating that those were added sometime what? Later. Which would suggest that he finished his work on 1st Esdras that had originally been assigned to him. And then for whatever reason, he takes up working on Wisdom 3-4. Similar to what Boyce's biographer said. Boyce's biographer said he did his allotted section, and then an additional portion was assigned to him because somebody hadn't basically kept up their end of the bargain. And I'm paraphrasing when I say that, okay? You understand that? So this evidence suggests that the Second Cambridge Company made individual assignments. The individuals worked on their assignments by themselves before they came together to discuss their work. Ward's notebook is indicative of first draft, independent work before any company discussion had taken place. You guys follow that? Back to the quote. Ward, the evidence suggests, was initially assigned the translation of 1st Esdras, but was requested at a subsequent point to help out with Wisdom 2. That's what I just said, right? Had he himself been the one initially assigned to the translation of Wisdom, it would have made no sense for him to start with the book's 3rd chapter as he did instead of what? The first. You guys following that? I keep saying that, but gotta have some confirmation here you're tracking with me. Yet, as Ward Draft also indicates, even books like 1st Esdras went on to become something more than strictly individual productions. The evidence for this goes beyond the sheer gap between the version of 1st Esdras proposed by Ward's draft and the book's eventual published form in the King James Bible. Ward's draft in certain places appears to show this very process occurring. At multiple points, for example, Ward seems to have gone back and added new material to the draft, and at least 2 such instances were almost assuredly in response to suggestions provided by others of his colleagues translating the Apocrypha, perhaps in the context of company-wide discussion. In the 2 cases in question, Ward added, sorry for the long quotes, but Ward added references to the work of celebrated early modern scholar Isaac Casaubon. So there's he showing up again. Okay? One regarding 1 Esdras chapter 3 verse 5, and the other regarding 1 Esdras chapter 4 verse 39. Yet, though Ward himself would come to have personal dealings with Casaubon following the latter's move to England in 1610, both of these references to Casaubon in the draft appear to have come by way of Boyce. Boyce was in the same company, assigned to the Second Cambridge Company, also translating the Apocrypha, as we already know. As Nicholas Hardy has recently shown, an edition of the Greek text of the Apocrypha, heavily annotated by Boyce, survives in the Bodleian Library, along with both 1 Esdras chapter 3 verse 5 and chapter 4 verse 9. Boyce has added notes seemingly drawn from the same 2 works by Casaubon that Ward cites. So understand what's going on, okay? This is where this gets absolutely fascinating. Ward here is working on 1 Esdras, right? He makes notes that seem to have come from Boyce. Here's Boyce's handwritten, a photo of Boyce's handwritten stuff. Here's the Septuagint, the Greek, the Apocryphal books in Greek. Here's Boyce's notes. And if you compare this from the Bodleian with this, no, sorry, not that, with this, for those 2 passages, 1 Esdras 4:39 and 1 Esdras 3:5, guess what you'll find out? You'll find out that both Boyce and Ward are commenting on the same thing from the same source, which is Casaubon, indicating had Boyce and Ward talked to each other. I would say they had. Boyce and Ward on the same translational company had talked to each other, and then does Ward amend this accordingly, or add notes accordingly to his document. Does everybody understand what's going on? So let me read that again. As Nicholas Hardy has recently shown, an edition of the Greek text of the Apocrypha, heavily annotated by Boyce, survives in the Bodleian Library alongside both 1 Esdras 3:5 and 1 Esdras 4:39. Boyce has added notes seemingly drawn from the same work by Casaubon that Ward cites. Moreover, in a letter that Boyce wrote to Casaubon around the same time, Boyce describes himself as having discussed those 2 portions of the Apocrypha, among others, with his colleagues at work on the King James translation. See how much more light now we can have? Do we see these guys doing independent work, talking to each other about the work, making further notes on the work, and then talking to other people, including this French guy who just moves to England, and they want to know what he thinks. So are they literally comparing it and trying to get as much information as they conceivably can to make the choice about how it should read? In each case, the Bible's published version of 1 Esdras would go on to reflect the proposed revisions drawn from Casaubon that Ward added. So the text of the King James Bible in those 2 verses, 1 Esdras 3:5 and 1 Esdras 4:39, reflects the changes that Ward added to the notebook from Casaubon. Read in conjunction with the evidence of Boyce's annotations and correspondence, such movements in the draft provide an unparalleled glimpse of the translator's early process of development stage by stage. Just as importantly, though, the draft also helps to illuminate movements where the translation did not develop, where the apocryphal books' appointed origins as individual productions still remain visible even in the King James Bible's published state. As a case in point, the addition of the Greek text of the Apocrypha to which Boyce made his annotations appears not to have been the same addition used by Ward for his draft. That is to say, different translators not only seem to have been initially assigned to the translation of different apocryphal books, but have to have gone about their work on the basis of different editions of the text to be translated itself. More than one 19th century scholar noticed that there seemed to be a maddening lack of consistency with regard to which version of the Apocryphal's Greek was being privileged at a given moment across the King James Bible. But none could quite figure out why or how this might have happened. Ward's draft provides an illustration. To what extent this complex, if also precarious interplay between the individual and group translations evidently at work in the Apocryphal Company points to the possibility of a similar dynamic at work across the Bible's 5 other translation companies is hard to say. In the end, though an awareness of that difficulty itself may represent one of the most valuable insights offered by the Ward draft, not only does it profoundly complicate the notion that members of a given company necessarily worked on the translation of each book together as a team, it forces us to think harder about the extent to which the companies necessarily set about their work in the same or even similar way. Now, let's stop there. We've talked about this already. The evidence strongly suggests that each of the companies did this a little bit differently. Okay? We've already talked about that. The King James Bible, in short, may be far more a patchwork of individual translations, the product of individual translators and individual companies working in individual ways, than has ever been properly recognized. So, everybody understand what he's saying there? So, we don't know, even with all this, we can say, I think, pretty strongly that in the case of the second Cambridge company that worked on the Apocrypha, that they definitely seem to have subdivided it out to individuals first. The individuals went through their assigned section and then they came to company meetings having already done their stuff as individuals. And then they discussed what the individual work was, and then they made group revisions to the individual work. We don't know if that's the way all the companies worked, but it does seem to be the way the second Cambridge company worked as far as going through the process. Many additional riches await to be gleaned from Ward's draft of 1 Esdras and Wisdom 3:4. It represents not just the earliest draft of the King James Bible now known to survive, but one utterly unlike any previous found. Ward's draft alone bears all the signs of having been a first draft, just as it alone can be definitely said to be in the hand of one of the King James translators themselves. It also stands as the only draft now known to survive of any part of the Apocrypha in the King James Bible, and the only draft yet to be discovered in Cambridge, one of the 3 initial centers of the Bible's composition. The true value of Ward's draft, though, lies less in the sheer fact of its uniqueness and more in what the draft, in its uniqueness, helps to reveal about one of the 17th century's most extraordinary cultural achievements. It points the way to a fuller, more complex understanding than ever before of the process by which the King James, the most widely read work in English of all time, came to be. Next week in lesson 164, we will consider some additional work in progress documents that need to be noted in the discussion before moving forward. So, folks, I could not leave this out. If we are in this class trying to track through this stuff, this needed to be included because this is a clearly first draft work. Now, this is important because this is the individual, independent work of Samuel Ward, member of the Second Cambridge Company, assigned to the Apocrypha, his personal, independent first draft work on this. It seems to corroborate the account of Walker in the Life of Boyce, that the Second Cambridge Company separated this out into sections, individuals were assigned, and in some cases where individuals weren't able or were not prepared to finish, the work was given to others, as in the case of what we see here in MS Ward B, because he only does Wisdom 3 through 4. He does not do the whole book. After, at the beginning, having done all of 1st Esdras, all 9 chapters in 66 pages. Okay? So, now here's the thing. A lot of people listening to this might seem to care less about it because this is pertaining to the Apocrypha, books that they don't view as scripture, and so they might be like, yeah, who cares, it's the Apocrypha. The reason it matters, and the reason we need to spend time understanding it, is because although it is the Apocrypha, something I don't believe is scripture or not canonical, and I wish this would have been like for Romans or Matthew or something like that, or Genesis or something. It's not. Knowing it and seeing it and studying it, does it still give us insight into the process the translators used? And that's really what we're after right now anyway, by looking at these work in progress documents. Okay? So, anybody have any questions or comments about MS Ward B? If you want to, you can go spend your time poking through here. I've done some of that. I obviously haven't looked up every single thing discussed. And I would also say that this essay by Miller, the earliest known draft from chapter 7 of Laborers in the Vineyard of the Lord, is definitely much more extensive than the one that I quoted from in this, which was the piece from the Literary Time. Is that what it's called? The Times Literary Supplement. But again, all this is being announced in 2015. This essay is written, I believe, in 2018, which is a much more full treatment of everything that's in Manuscript Ward B. So does anybody have any questions or comments? So, last Monday on the 10th, I didn't know any of this stuff. And here we go today, and I just taught a whole lesson on it. Unfortunately, some of these essays are like copyright restricted because I had to pay for them. So I can't, on some of them I couldn't, even if I wanted to, make extensive quotes probably, because I could maybe get in trouble for that. So I'm trying to be mindful of that. But for the purposes of this lesson, following the shorter piece from the Literary Times was perfectly sufficient. I didn't need to go in all the detail that he goes into here. If you want to know more about it, I would recommend, reading the earliest known draft of the King James Bible, Samuel Ward's draft of 1st Esdras and Wisdom 3:4. But I believe it is the earliest known draft. I believe it does contain the individual work of a translator, and I think it's significant and important, even though it is on the Apocrypha, for getting a full picture of what happened. So, I'm done talking unless somebody has any questions. We are done a few minutes early, which is rare around here. But does anybody have any questions about anything that we went over?
Just a curiosity, when it said that the translation, out of his own house should a tree be taken and therefore be hanged, does that really mean a tree taken, or just that a tree on his property was used to hang him? Because why would you take a tree somewhere else to hang somebody on it. I mean,
It means
doesn't
the
make
tree
any
would be
sense.
cut down or taken from his own property. And he would be hung on a tree that he owns, is my understanding
Like
of
a
it.
cross or something? I mean, why would you take a tree down?
I don't know that I don't know that
Hanging
he's
somebody
taking
is
it
to have
down as
support.
much as the tree from his own property is being used to hang him upon that tree.
Yeah,
Yeah.
but I'm thinking it's just a convoluted way to say, hang him on a tree on his property. Why would you move the tree?
What page are you on?
5,
Where at again?
about the top third of the page there, the first, bottom of the first paragraph. It just seems odd that you would cut a tree down and then hang him on it somewhere else.
I think any oddities there are coming in the following way. First of all, the allegedly, I'm gonna say it that way, allegedly, the apocryphal books were originally written in Hebrew.
Oh,
Then they were translated into Greek, and the Bishop's Bible and the King James Bible are allegedly working off of the Greek translation. So it would seem to me that any oddities in the verbiage there would probably be related to the source and an attempt to have fidelity to the source language instead of just like doing what you just said. What were you gonna say, Mike?
I think out of his own house doesn't necessarily, it means property, house and property.
yeah, that's what I was kind of thinking, it's just a
Yeah.
convoluted way to say it.
Yep.
Unless he had a sawmill on his property and they could cut it up and take it somewhere.
Which that'd be a total inference. I
Yeah,
mean,
that's
the text would give you no reason to think that. But I hope you can see that when you look at Boyce's annotated Greek Old Testament, and when you look at what ultimately ends up in the King James Bible, and you look at Manuscript Ward B, you can see how they literally are taking the Bishop's Bible and are conforming it into what would be the King James Bible through, in this case, individual work and group discussion. And even in some cases, discussion with a guy outside of the group altogether whose comment they wanted, in the case of the Frenchman Casaubon, who comes to reside in England in 1910. Okay? So you've got, this speaks to a very meticulous process that they're following here, where they are attempting to leave no stone unturned in how they're going about this. Yeah.
And when you look at the 15 rules of translation, it's exactly what it says, how they should go about it. First individually, and then getting together in groups, and then the larger group. So it's spelled out in 8, 9, and 10
Yeah.
of the rules.
So this group does seem to have been stickler to the letter of the rules. Other groups seems to have fudged on certain parts of it here and there. And that's why Gordon Campbell in his book said that the King James Bible, there are elements of taking shortcuts, and there are also elements of going way the extra mile.
And it does say they can consult with outside experts.
It does say that as well. Now we have an example of that happening with the Casaubon letters, which we're going to talk about next week. Okay? All right. Any other questions? Appreciate your attention. Again, was not anticipating even doing this lesson, but when the information came across my radar, I'm like, okay, we got to talk about that, because to not talk about it would be to leave a gap, especially if there's so much information known about it. So anyway, thanks for your attention. Next week